Lupita Mañana, Chapter 8. Lupita leaped up, ran over to the dishwasher, and pulled on Salvador's arm. La migra has come! Linda says for us to get away! Pronto! She hissed. Salvador stopped, dropping a dish on the floor. Then he called out softly to Valentin, who stood on the side of the machine. La migra! But Valentin went on working. He couldn't hear over the noise. Salvador didn't wait to deliver his warning a second time. Without removing his apron, he bolted after Lupita out the back door into the alley. Passing her, he ran to a boarded-off area that concealed the cafe's dozen garbage cans. Quickly, he dropped down among them, and Lupita squatted beside him. In a minute, they saw Valentin come out the rear door, handcuffed to a gringo. They went to a car and got into the back seat. A few minutes later, a weeping Concha was brought out of the motel and also put into the car. Afterward, 2 of the 3 immigration officials went into the little yellow house. Senora Rodrigo followed them, shaking his head. Lupita whispered, "Perhaps they will think that 4 of us are living there. Perhaps they will wait for us." She bit her knuckles in fear. Frowning, Salvador growled, "They won't stay in the house, but they might come back to it." He paused, then whispered, "Lupita, we won't go back there." He stripped off his apron and draped it over a garbage can. "When the cars leave, we're going to start for Indio. We'll walk there." "Tonight, Salvador?" "Si." "Do you know the road to take?" "Si. I asked the cook last week to tell me where it is. He told me that what number road goes there. Gringo roads have numbers like Mexican roads, and numbers look the same even if words don't. There's nobody to buy bus tickets for us, so we have to walk. But first, I'll see Senor Rodrigo and ask for the last of my wages. You go ask Senor Elfren for yours." Lupita nodded. Salvador was right. She wanted to leave as quickly as possible, too. The Torres children kept watch from their hiding place until the Immigration and Naturalization Service car drove off with its prisoners in the back seat. Senor Rodrigo came slowly back toward the kitchen, looking at the ground. Lupita and Salvador stood up and intercepted the cafe owner. "It was a bad business this time," he said, shaking his head. "The man who forged the cards was caught. He told the police that some Mexican nationals were working here. The police told La Migra, and you know the rest. You 2 are lucky they didn't find you." He nodded. "Lucky that Linda warned you in time. Often, La Migra come back again soon, so it would be best for you to leave here now." "It is our wish to go, senor," Salvador told him. "Pay me what you owe me, and we will go tonight." Senor Rodrigo nodded. "That will be all right with me. Go to the house and get your things. Then come back to the kitchen. I have money in the cash register." While Salvador walked across the alley to the yellow house, Lupita went to the motel. She found Senor Elfren and told him that she and Salvador were leaving right away. The motel keeper agreed. "See, go somewhere where nobody will know your cards are forged. I'll give you your wages as soon as you get out of my maid's uniform. That must remain here." 10 minutes later, Lupita and Salvador came out of the yellow house, wearing their old clothes. Although they looked the same as they had leaving Tijuana, this time they had money in their pockets. The thought was a comfort to Lupita. But they must buy food for their journey, more crackers and canned beans, and perhaps some cheese too. Most certainly they would need canteens for water. Lupita touched Salvador's arm as he came out of the kitchen stuffing dollars into his pockets. "Salvador, por favor, do not try to get a ride for us from any automobiles here." He laughed. "Do you think I could forget what happened just the last time?" He pointed to his feet. "Now I trust these most of all. The cook wrote down the way for me while I waited for old Rodrigo. He said that pochos may try to help us, and we should trust them. He is a good man. I will miss him." Salvador paused. "I will miss Valentin, too." Lupita nodded, thinking of Linda, who had saved them. "See, there were good pochos." As they passed behind the rear of the motel and cafe, Lupita sighed deeply. She had left the blue dress hanging in the closet. Salvador had told her it must remain behind. How could she pretend to be a boy if she was caught with a dress stuffed into her jacket pocket? Hearing her sigh, Salvador said angrily, "Don't start that again. Remember, you are my brother. What did I name you in Tijuana?" "Eduardo. I am Eduardo." Lupita stifled a second sigh. She didn't much like the name, but Eduardo she must pretend to be until they reached the fine house of Aunt Consuelo and her pocho husband. He would surely be a good man and find work for them. He would know the ways of the United States. Lupita looked up at the sky for the first stars. See, there was one, not far from the new moon, the very one she had pointed out as Papa's star in Ensenada just last month. How long ago that seemed. Lupita's chest tightened with loneliness. The company in the little house had not made up for the loss of her family. She straightened her shoulders. Salvador, living with Aunt Consuelo will be like living at home. I saw a photograph of Aunt Consuelo when she and Mama were girls. They look very much alike, even if she is rich and Mama is poor. At an open shopping center on Valley Boulevard, they bought 2 canteens and a hardware store and some food in the supermarket. By now, most of them were familiar with gringo money and how cash registered worked. It was easy to watch the figures on the cash register, then hand over paper money and pocket the change. The gringo clerks didn't seem to notice them, nor did the service station boy when they filled their canteens from the water hose. When they had what they needed, they started down Valley Boulevard, traveling east. In 2 hours, they were out of the city and in open country. Salvador stopped. The highway we need is called a freeway, but the gringo law doesn't permit us to walk there. Why not? The cook told me it's too dangerous. He said that we should travel on the city streets, keeping the freeway in sight or in hearing distance all the time. How can we hear it? He says the freeway roars like the sea because the many cars can go swiftly on it. Lupita frowned. Cars, more cars. Where will we find the right road, Salvador? Out in the fields here. The cook said we would come to a place where several roads come together in the sky. In the sky? Lupita pressed the old cloth sack with their food to her breast. Who had ever heard of roads in the sky? Could even gringos build roads like that? A half hour later, when she spied the enormous elevated interchange loom up ahead of them, she gasped and put one hand to the side of her face. There they were, the roads in the sky. The streams of white and red dots, headlights and taillights astounded her. Salvador, she whispered, what shall we do? What direction do we take? We go up into the mountains over the San Gorgonio Pass, and from there into the desert. You have seen the mountains from Colton. But how do we find the road we need? She pointed to the great interchange overhead. Come on, the cook told me how to do it. Lupita followed Salvador into the meadows that lay beneath the vast concrete arches. They ducked under barbed wire fences and scrabbled in and out of ditches that crisscrossed beneath the freeways, ever aware of the frightening, ocean-like roaring over their heads. Salvador soon found the road he wanted. He pointed it out and said, Lupita, we'll walk in the fields alongside this big road as far as we can. Then we can hide in a ditch if a car stops. Where will we sleep tonight? We won't sleep tonight at all. We must travel by night while it is cool and dark. At dawn, I'll find a place for us to sleep. After a few more miles, Lupita saw the shape of the freeway had changed. It was no longer straight and flat, but had begun to dip, and now it ran at the bottom of high banks covered with green plants. We have to leave sight of the freeway now, Salvador told her, and walk on the bordering streets. Not even a goat could walk these steep banks. Lupita agreed. What strange roads the gringos built, sometimes up in the sky, at other times out of sight in the earth. She felt as small and frightened as she had in the pauper car, and she prayed they would get to Aunt Consuelo soon. That first day they slept under a small bridge in the suburbs of Riverside. The bridge spanned a dry gully, which sheltered them as they slept. At nightfall, they started out once more. After several hours, they found Highway 60 and walked along parallel streets within hearing distance of it. At daybreak, Salvador found a large concrete culvert, part of a drainage system for them to crawl into. Lupita's sleep was fitful. She kept awakening to think of the climb they would soon have to make through the mountains and of the desert that lay on the other side. Uncle Antonio told her of the deserts in Baja California, describing them as terrible places of heat, sand, and bare rocks with no water to be found. As she and Salvador set out that night, Lupita asked, Have you thought about water for our canteens in the mountains and the desert? See, we will find water at gas stations. The cook said there are service stations everywhere in this state. But La Migra could be waiting at the stations. Salvador laughed sharply. That's a risk we must take. We must have water. The end of that night's journey brought them to the base of the mountains. There, they stopped to fill their canteens at an all-night service station. The attendant paid no heed to them. He was occupied with a gringo car that drove in at the same moment. Its radiator was boiling over, and clouds of steam rose from under the hood. Salvador found a gully off the road for them to sleep in, and the next evening they began their climb up the winding mountain road. Finally, at daybreak, they came into flat country. This time, they rested in a tiny box canyon to the right of the highway. Too weary to eat, Lupita fell asleep at once. At nightfall, Salvador had to shake her awake. She found it hard to keep her eyes open while she ate. The climb up the mountain had been terrible. Sometimes she had felt like putting her hands under her knees to lift them up for the next step. How her legs and feet ached now. But she must walk much farther to reach Indio. That night, the two of them drifted like smoke through the twin towns of Beaumont and Banning, and the rising of the sun found them in the Mojave Desert. As the sun came up through the milky, fiery mist, a blue pickup truck came roaring down the highway behind them. It was the only car on the road. The Torres children stopped for an instant to look around. "It is a truck," Salvador said. "La Migra drives sedans. Keep on walking, Lupita." As they began to move on, the pickup slowed its speed to stay behind them. The driver, a young gringo, started to yell, and so did his passenger, another youth. Suddenly, the truck jumped off the road onto the shoulder where Lupita and Salvador were walking. The horn blared, and the two young men shouted again. "Robbers? More robbers?" thought Lupita in panic. "Run!" Salvador shouted, as he leaped onto the pebble-strewn sand below the road. Lupita fled after him, running through the creosote bushes, and burrowed to a side road leading into the desert. To her horror, the pickup came in pursuit, jolting down the unpaved road behind them. The youths shouted and laughed. "Wetbacks! Hey, wetbacks! Run! Run!" The driver didn't catch up to them or pass them. He and his companions stayed a distance behind and continued yelling. In spite of her terror, Lupita realized that the young men were playing with them. They meant to herd them like cattle. What would they do when they tired of their game? All at once, the desert road went over a sand dune. Below the dune, a giant boulder blocked the roadway. "Lupita!" cried Salvador as he fled behind the boulder. An instant later, Lupita crouched there too, wondering what the two gringos would do. She looked over her shoulder and saw miles of soft, gray-white sand. If they tried to drive the pickup behind the rock, it would get mired in the sand. But even without their car, the young men were dangerous. What terrible thing would happen now? Lupita and Salvador didn't have long to wait. Ping! A bullet struck the top of the boulder and ricocheted off. For several minutes, the two gringos shot at the boulder, guffawing in the distance. Weeping, Lupita flattened herself against the rock. Salvador cursed continuously in Spanish. While he cursed, she prayed that the men would not come after them. What was to stop them? Who was to stop them? But after a while, she heard the pickup's motor start. It turned around and began to bump back along the road going toward the highway. "Salvador! Salvador!" Lupita wept, clinging to her brother. "The devils have gone." After a moment, he added, through clenched teeth, "We won't go back to the highway. They could be waiting there for us. Let's go down the road and find a place to rest." "See, Salvador, see! Don't go back to the highway yet." The place they found some distance down the road was an abandoned prospector's cabin. It was an ugly little building without a front door, set in a landscape of distant gray-brown mountains and flat white-gray basins. The only color was some dark, spindly bushes and spinery cacti. The shack seemed haunted. "I do not like it here," Lupita said as they ate and drank. Salvador shook his head. "La Migra will not find us here, and the gringos cannot come here because the sand is so soft. Go to sleep, Lupita." But Lupita lay awake on the floor for a long time, listening to the daytime noises of the desert. She heard frightening bird shrieks and the dry sound of something moving under the floorboards. Were animals living under there? When she put an eye to the knothole on the floor, she discovered two thick-bodied rattlesnakes, taking refuge from the fierce sun. Lupita shuddered, rolled over to Salvador's back, and held tightly to him. He did not awaken. She would warn him before they started out again in the evening, for the snakes would come out then, too. The next night, she and Salvador walked through the luxurious desert resort city of Palm Springs. Once more, they filled their canteens at a service station on the eastern edge of the town. The attendant was a middle-aged pocho. He asked them in Spanish, "What do you kids want?"